Hello, welcome back to Outbuilding. Today I'm going to work on the slide action for this workbench that I'm building that's going to house my table saw. So it's going to be kind of like a miter gauge on a sliding sled. And this is the second component of the sled, the part that you'll actually be making contact with. And then there's the black piece here is the intermediate piece. And I've made those each in a different video leading up to this. And so if you want to look back, you can see those. But today I'm going to put all that together. There's a little sprocket drive that's going to kind of run on a chain to hopefully coordinate the action of those. And then this whole workbench is starting to get pretty heavy, and so I'm going to do a couple more cabinet pieces so that it's sturdy enough that I can crane it up and put it up into its final resting place, where I'll start to build out a big workstation island. Table saw will then get moved into that. So let's get started. So to get started, I need to take each of these components and add a bunch of hardware to them. And I'm going to start with the black sort of intermediate piece first. And you can see it's got some hardware mounted on it, but I'm going to take all that off. I'm going to do a little bit of finish work, clean up some things and cut some more holes, and then I'll put it all together. One problem I encountered was that the linear guide block was interfering with the bolt from another linear guide block when I first put this together, and so I found some much lower profile sort of button head screws that were stainless and they still were metric and fit. So I tried fitting those, and that seemed to give me enough clearance in this one little case where I had interference so that the blocks worked smoothly, which was great because I didn't have to then route that or sort of countersink those bolts or do something crazy, especially because it was already assembled. Another problem I had to work through is this end cap, which I need to be able to remove so I can load the thing onto the rails. The screws that I put in kind of split the MDF apart, and I haven't used this MDF before, and it seems to be, if you go straight into it perpendicular to the surface, it's actually holds the screw really well, but if you go onto the on edge, it tends to split. And so I'm going to try to fix that by putting some adhesive in there and clamping it down and sort of kind of heal that up, and then I'll re-drill them a little bit bigger. This doesn't have to be super strong, but it has to be strong enough to resist, the thing sliding off the end of the rail if I run it to the end of the extreme. So I'm just removing the cap here, and I'll mess with some glue and see if I can't get those cracks to heal up. Using some slow cure epoxy I had sitting around, I mixed up a batch and then just kind of poured it on top of those things on end and let gravity do the work of drawing that down into the cracks. And I had some days that I was doing some other stuff, so I let that cure and get really hard before re-drilling it and then re-putting in the screws and mounting this up to test it. So across this black intermediate piece will be two axles that kind of transfer the motion from one side to the other, and they're 1/2-inch stainless steel rods that are too long. So I measured the box and cut these things down, deburred the edges, and then I used just an angle grinder to kind of create a flat in there just so that the set screw would hold tight. And I'll get all this fit together, and the last time I put it together, I'll put thread lock on it and try to really lock this thing down. But for now, I just kind of wanted to get these roughed into the right shape, make sure they could slide through and fit, and get everything ready to kind of load the sprockets up and see how the whole thing worked. This workbench isn't a piece of fine furniture, but I did want to kind of learn a little bit more about the MDF, so I went ahead and used some Danish oil to treat it, and that was something that the supplier said would work pretty well. So I'm giving this a try. It seemed to take it in pretty well. I don't know if it dries out or it soaks in, but just give it a little bit of preservative, and then if I do use this for furniture in the future, I'll kind of know how it responds. So with everything dried and ready to go, I went ahead and used the interior screws which hold into plywood and didn't have any issues. I used that to secure the back to get it positioned properly, and then I re-drilled those holes that I had glued over, and that seemed to work pretty well. It's not perfect, but it was a good way to kind of remedy that driving of the screw into the end of the MDF, which I'll try to avoid in future design stuff. With the box done, I could start loading up the hardware, and I had to kind of think through how to put it in the right order. So I'm putting in these linear blocks with those smaller clearance bolts here. And then I loaded the rail on just to these blocks while they were still kind of loose so that I could make sure they were aligned well, so that the rail would kind of make them parallel to one another, or hopefully get them closer. And then I went ahead and tightened those up, and then I moved on to the next part. This side rail is one that I'd already mounted, so it was all ready to go, and I just used spacer blocks to make sure I had it lined up properly, got everything set up, and then drove all the Allen wrenches in. And I got a nice little new T-handled wrench that made it a lot easier to tighten these down quickly. I then added the 2 bottom rails using spacer blocks and a bunch of more hardware, and tightened all that down and got everything kind of set up so that all the action stuff that was going to go on the slide part of this first piece, it was all ready to go. I put back in the plates that hold the bearings. These I'd machined in a previous video, and these just allow the rotation to go from one chain to the other across the intermediate piece here. The linear rails on the intermediate piece will slide on blocks that are mounted to the frame. So I'm marking the spots on the frame where those blocks should rest. It's not super critical. As long as they're parallel, they can be slightly offset, but I'm marking out where to put them so that when I load the thing on, it's heavy, and I can kind of then position stuff and figure out where to drill. With all the hardware loaded up and the markings in place, I can wrestle this piece on and start to sort of position those things and figure out where to drill the holes. And it's a little bit of a mess getting it on here, but I got it up in position, loaded the blocks, and then I could sort of position them based on my marks and get everything aligned to test the action of the linear guides. Here I'm using a spacer block, and the square is sort of the depth gauge. And I can mark that depth and then recreate that same measurement with my little drilling jig on the frame with the slide completely out of the way, and put the holes in for those blocks there to mount to the frame. With the slide component out of the way, I used those measurements I'd already made for depth and transferred them back down onto the frame, and then used a jig that I'd made in a previous video for drilling these holes, and positioned the jig, drilled the holes partway through, and then I drilled them through on the other side so that I had nice clean holes all the way through. And then with everything drilled, I could go ahead and mount the component using those guide block holes. With the first set of guide blocks held fast against the frame, I could position the lower ones and check their depth from the side of the frame, and go ahead and mark those so that I could do the same process and drill these out and put in the blocks on the bottom. With the rails in position on the blocks, I went ahead and tightened everything down. With the linear bearings all set up, I went ahead and loaded the axles and set the sprockets on there and tightened up the set screws so I could transfer the motion of this first slide across to the second slide. I need to get an accurate measurement of the center pin of the chain, both on the top and the bottom of the sprockets, so that I can have the chain come in high on one side and come out low the other side. With those marked, I came through with a small pilot bit and drilled all the way through, and then I came in from one side big enough that the bolt and washer would fit through there, so it was kind of recessed, and the other side was enough for the bore of the pin that the chain is hooked up to. So this is kind of a way I can create a tensioner that I can adjust. With both sides put together, then I could do an actual as-built measurement for the chain, kind of accommodating the one master link that I was going to put in. So I measured that out, marked it, and then fought with the little chain breaker to crack the chain at that spot to create a chain that was, I could tension, but that was the right length. With the chain the right length, I was able to put in the master link and clip in its little retainer and then slightly tension the chain up just to get a feel for it and then give it a first test run. All right, well, I got a new day to work with, and I'm going to work on the second of these slides. And I just want to take a second and thank you for watching this and sticking through this build. This has taken quite a bit longer chronologically than I thought. I ended up having a tractor that broke down in the middle of all this and had to go out once it got fixed and bring it back out and get a bunch of stuff done because everything was growing like crazy, and just a bunch of other delays that have kind of prolonged this project. It's also taken a lot longer to get built because I'm becoming really nervous about having it work well, and so then I'm spending a lot of time really thinking it through and kind of doing the steps carefully. This first slide worked pretty well. It's got a little bit of like friction to it, and I don't think that's the slides. I think that's a little bit of the gear train, and so I'm kind of curious to see when I get the second one set up, which I'll work on today. And I'll show you how I'm going to put the rails on kind of one at a time so that I'm trying to keep them straight and linear and use one rail to sort of guide me in the next one. So I'll put those rails on and we'll get the rest of the gear train hooked up and see how this thing works. So when I left this piece in a previous video, I had one more brace to put across the back, and I went ahead and glued that in and clamped it up. And then I sanded this thing, measured it, and checked it for flatness and everything, and I was really glad to see that it came out really flat and true and square, which is nice because that's going to kind of be the exterior part that's going to create the surface for the workbench and also the motion piece. The goal with this first side rail, to avoid any binding or anything, is to make it as parallel as possible with the bottom, which is the surface you see that looks vertical right now. But that's the bottom, and I've got some little gauge blocks that I rigged up so that I could sort of align the gauge with the bottom piece there, regardless of what it measured out down below, and make sure that it was super parallel. So I marked that out. I'm using these rails as their own drilling jig because they're super uniform and they clamp really easily. So I clamped it down and then ran through with the drill and pre-drilled all the holes for the mounting. was also pretty sure that these rails are consistent one to another, but in case they're not, I went ahead and marked this rail against its location in case I ever pull them out and need to put them back in and get them in the right order and orientation. For this rail, I'm once again using blind T-nuts, so I went back with the clearance holes and opened them up so that I could get the blind T-nuts in there, and then went ahead and mounted the rail. So the next thing I need to do is put in the top rail, and that's going to really dictate how level the thing is. And so I kind of loaded everything up and dry fit it so that I could get it on there and figure out how far in to position the rail. And this actually proved useful because it occurred to me that I had to space out the side rail a little bit, and I did that on the block side, not the rail side, just because of the thickness of the stack up of things. So I went ahead and loaded everything up, got this thing positioned on there, and then figured out how much of a spacer I needed. So with the second slider positioned on top of the rails, I was able to figure out the thickness, and it was about what I'd figured in the drawings to be about 1/8 of an inch. So I had some acrylic, and I drilled it out and broke the first piece I made, but then was able to make a couple successful little pieces. And for now, I just taped them on the blocks to create the space I needed because I was going to drill these holes later, and I didn't need to do it right away. So with the proper spacing, I loaded it back up and everything was moving freely and looked pretty good. So then I went ahead and cut a couple little spacers to fit in on the blocks and clamped everything together just so that when I was setting up my drill points for the mounts, I didn't have any movement or anything, and it would end up being true. I have the level here set, so I know I'm going to get the right results if I can recreate this without the spacers. I did this on both ends of the slides so that I knew that they would also be parallel. With everything positioned just how I wanted it, I went ahead and marked both sides, pulled it off, and prepared to drill so that these rails could be mounted right where I had everything positioned, and to recreate this without the spacers. So I pulled these last two rails and went ahead and drilled the holes for those, and I used the rails as the jigs again, the same thing with the blind T-nuts, and just the same process to get these all set up and get them finally mounted. As I got these rails mounted up, I realized that to load it up, I was going to need to move the sprockets out of the way. So I popped the sprockets out, and I didn't really have a good way to load them in once that outer slide was in place. And so I had to cut some access holes in the outer slide so that I could gain access and put in the axles once the slide was put in place on its rails. So now I've got all three rails on, but I've got two more blocks to go, and so I went ahead and loaded this on, set the blocks out there to position them and figure out where they needed to be, and then pulled it off and mounted the blocks while I was building the access holes for the axles as well. More alignment tricks, more spacer blocks, and more drilling jigs to get all these holes in and mount all the rest of the blocks. And then I moved over to the other piece and started cutting out the hole for the axle access, which was pretty straightforward. So the last thing I needed to do was figure out a way to get the chain to mount in this outer piece, because the chain was going to be in the outer piece and then engage those sprockets. So I kind of added a second block here, created sort of my recess that I did like on the other side, prepared the chain and made sure that this was measured out so that it was sort of offset so it could come in on one side of the sprockets and leave on the other side of the sprockets. And this was just a little arts and crafts project with some gluing of the block and everything to both stiffen that and also give me that relief. And I got all that set up. So I got those set up, and then I could go about putting on the chain and figuring out how much link to pull out, and I used the sprockets just kind of held in place to kind of approximate that. I had enough sort of leeway with the tensioning that I could kind of get close. I kind of erred on the side along and got it set up and did this all on the bench while it was easier to reach. So with the slide completely finished and the chain all ready, I went ahead and loaded it up, and it was a little bit challenging. It was pretty fiddly to kind of get those axles in there and get the chain wrapped around it. But eventually I got it kind of put together and got the chain in there and was able to kind of slide it out to one extreme and tension it a little bit. And I could try the action out and see if it even worked. Well, that was pretty fussy, but that worked. I got the axles to go through there, and I had to kind of fight with them to get them in and get them engaged. And I'm happy to say that this thing's actually working. I have to figure out how to adjust it. It's just they're a little bit out of phase. But the basic idea is that when you move, like if I move the black one, it walks down that little chain and it sends the axle motion over to the other side, which is opposite, and so it drives the other one out twice at just as far as the black one moves. So they move. It's like a divider, and so that black one will always stay centered in the middle, which means I can overhang it a lot. I did find one bearing that had popped out, and I was able to pop it back in. And so I'm going to look around and make sure I didn't lose any others on the floor here. But I'm going to stop and take a break for a meal. But I'm super excited. I think I can adjust it to get it so that the top one is aligned with the frame when the black one is right where you want it to be. And this side is all aligned. It's pretty smooth, and I can adjust both the linear guides and the chain to make it a little smoother if I need to, once I get it sort of locked in. So if you've watched my other videos, I did sort of a test workbench out of MDF, and I used that to create a little hole system for doing jigs and alignments with 20mm holes. And that's been really great for alignment. I don't love the MDF surface as a work surface because it absorbs a lot of dirt, and so it stains pretty easily. It's also, for a table saw or something where you're trying to slide things across, like a router deck or a table saw, it's a little sticky, and so it's good for if you're just setting a piece of material down and track saw cutting. It's actually good because it kind of holds it down. But if you're trying to slide across like you would on a table saw, it's a little bit too sticky, so then you're kind of pushing hard into the blade, which you don't want to do. So I tried I used my vacuum press, which I kind of resurrected, and I put down a piece of Formica, just some cheap Formica that I had sitting around. And then I tried using the PARF system, or the UJK system, to drill some holes, and it works just fine in this surface. So I'm going to go with kind of a Formica top on an MDF base. The MDF is nice and stout. It'll hold everything true and flat. And I can then drill these holes and use that for jigging and for mounting down my fence and some other things. So I'm going to order some Formica and get that in. And I was checking the thickness stack up. So, I've got the 2 layers of sliding piece here. And then stacked up, I need to have the right dimension between the base where my table saw is going to sit and the upper deck. And I've got just enough space to do a little bit of shimming to get that to be dead flat and match up with what's here and what's going to be around the rest of it, this around. And it's interesting, I got a criticism about, somebody commented on my video about some sort of like unnecessary giant table saw. And it's actually a really small table saw. It's about 2 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet if you take the cast wings off of it. And I'm not building a giant table saw, I'm building a giant bench, and I'm putting the table saw in it. And so everybody will choose what they want, and certainly you don't need this tool, but if you're gonna cut big cabinet pieces and wanna do it repetitively and have them be accurate, for me, this is a good way to do it. So that's why I'm doing this. It's also kind of fun to try something new. I haven't seen this slide action, and it works, it's working really pretty well. It's maybe slightly less smooth than I had originally hoped, and it's got a lot of mass to it, so it's kind of got a lot of inertia. I think some of that's just going to come down to adjustment, but that mechanism with the chain to kind of split the difference is working really well, and I can refine that. I'm going to put some little foam stops in there, and should work well for what I want to do. So in my next video, I'll probably move this up. I've got a bunch of, this is a whole camping rig that I've got for my former coaching duties that I'm handing off to the new coach. So I've got to kind of get some stuff shuffled around, and that's why I'm kind of cutting this video off here, because I need to make space and get this moved up to where it's going to finally be. I'll build a subframe around that and cut holes in it for power, and I'll show you how I'm going to set that up. I'm also going to do dust collection through these modules, and so I'll kind of start getting that set up. And then I'll put my cabinet carcasses in there, and that'll start to lock all these frame elements, these plywood laminated frames. It'll lock them together and give the whole thing a bunch of structural rigidity. And then eventually I need to kind of flip the saw over, and I'm trying to get as far as I can so that I can use my existing saw deck before I put in the other one. So those are my next steps. I look forward to seeing you. I really appreciate you sticking around and watching these videos. And I keep thinking it's going to get further along in each one of these than it does, but that's just the reality of trying to do something new and learning as I go. So thanks for watching. Until I see you next, I'll be out building. Take care.